We turn to Emily Tisch Sussman. Emily is a Democratic strategist with a long history of advocating for progressive change on a range of issues, including gay rights. Emily, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
Do you think that, I don't know what number you'd attach to it, but I'd argue a plurality of Americans thought that this was settled law, that we already, this went before the Supreme Court, and with Olbrich fell, it was the law of the land. Do you think a lot of people are surprised to find out that the court, A, is hearing a case, and the case has the potential consequence to redefine here rights completely?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of Americans would be very surprised to understand how many LGBT Americans can be fired from their jobs, can be kicked out of housing, can be denied housing, can be denied from homeless shelters and basic rights. Look, the Trump administration is putting forth new regulations that may say that more doctors can decide not to treat LGBT patients just because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, which is just unbelievably unfair. Like, it feels so basic, right? Like, we believe in the freedoms of core values as Americans, that you can hold a job, that you can live where you want to live, you can access basic health care, right? Like, we believe those to be freedoms. And to think this administration is not only not moving with the progress and acknowledging these are basic rights for Americans, but are actually moving backwards on the progress, I think would really surprise a lot of people, particularly in the face of the fact that marriage is now considered to be a basic right for all Americans founded in the Constitution. The housing and the employment discrimination are based in established federal law and federal protections, and it would be a real step backwards for the Supreme Court to find otherwise.
If anybody thinks this is just about, a baker not wanting to make a cake for a gay couple for their wedding, you're talking about being able to be fired with no cause other than the fact that they don't think gays should be able to be married or employed by them, or moreover that they think that they should basically have rights being denied. But to me, and obviously we agree on this, but take us out of this. This does seem to be a policy in search of a problem, and by that I mean every poll I look at, and you follow this more closely than I do, the American public seems to have gotten with the times in this. They don't have a problem. The military didn't even have a problem having gays serve openly in the military, let alone transgender. It seems this is tyranny of the minority.
A solution in search of a problem is probably the best way I've heard it categorized. Look, the Trump administration stood up the Office of, I believe it was Religious Exemptions, Religious Civil Rights, which was literally that, a solution in search of a problem. Up until the point that, civil rights enforcement into the Department of Health and Human Services was already covered in the Office of Civil Rights, and they had about 1.25 cases. That's 1.25 cases a year based on religious exemptions, and now they've stood up an entire office to it and dedicated even more budget to it. So they're literally in search of finding a problem. Look, you referenced the military and the integration of lesbian and gay service members into the military. That was a law that I worked on for years. And let me tell you, everything we heard from the opposition, this would make our armed forces weaker, this would decay morale. Not a single one of those things turned out to be true. In fact, everyone within the military ranks would tell you it strengthened the military, because what it actually did is what it kept service members from having to lie. They didn't have to lie about who they are in their personal lives anymore, and so therefore their unit cohesion was actually even stronger than it was before. Last week, for the Trump administration to now actually have by law that transgender military service members cannot serve is a huge step backwards. We know there are already trans service members there. So it moves us backwards in all sorts of ways, and it's not helping. It actually hurts. It makes us weaker.
I know it's always dangerous to read the tea leaves with the Supreme Court, but nonetheless, this seems pretty basic as discrimination. If they're going to let two people marry, why shouldn't somebody be able to work or get medical care? Do you think the court's taking this up just to finally put clarity on it, or do you think in this 5-4 world we live in, we have no idea how they could rule on this?
We never have any idea, but we like to pretend that we do anyway. There is split circuits, which does mean that it is right for the Supreme Court to take up the case. There are different decisions coming out of different circuits. It is overwhelmingly in favor of on the side of the employee who should not be discriminated against. So it does feel like ideally they would rule on that side. I'd also mention that there is legislation moving through Congress, the Equality Act, which would make it federal law that you could not discriminate against somebody based on housing, employment, and basic needs, which would just clarify it, right? Which would make it the law of the land and make it very simple. What's amazing about the stance of the Trump administration is that while they have been systematically chipping away at protections across the board in health, in housing, in education for LGBT Americans, Trump actually still, many of his supporters still will say that he is great for the LGBT community, and they point to the fact that they had like one gays for Trump, I think, at the convention. And so you never really know what's going to happen, but it's that in the fact that if it was actually passed miraculously by the Senate, that he would sign it into law, I guess. But it does feel like if the court has been struggling this much with these three cases and moving them through, it's likely they're going to rule pretty narrowly on the issues in front of them and not have a more sweeping judgment on whether you could wholeheartedly categorize sexual orientation and gender discrimination under pre-existing federal laws and protections.
Well, Emily, I suppose we're going to find out in a few months. Thank you so much, as always.